In July 1944, as bombs still fell over Europe, 730 delegates gathered in a quiet New Hampshire resort. The official goal? Plan the post-war economy. But behind closed doors, a quieter panic was unfolding. The war had drained the coffers of the most powerful empires on earth. The United Kingdom was functionally bankrupt. The United States, though victorious, was spending $250 million a day, and not all of it was coming from taxes or savings. The public was told, buy war bonds, support the troops, secure victory. It sounded noble. It felt patriotic. But the numbers told a different story. By 1945, the U.S. Treasury had issued over $185 billion in war bonds. On paper, it looked like the American people had financed the war through savings. In reality, the Federal Reserve had quietly become the largest buyer of these bonds. Not individuals, not families, not even banks. The money, in large part, was created out of thin air. A new system was forming. Not just military-industrial, but monetary-industrial. Debt became the engine, and belief became the fuel. People thought they were lending their dollars. In fact, they were lending their trust. This wasn't accidental. In the early 1940s, internal memos from the U.S. Treasury made one goal clear: maintain the appearance of voluntary financing. The phrase appears more than once. It was a psychological operation dressed as an investment campaign. And yet, the illusion held. Posters showed smiling children, heroic soldiers, flags waving. Buy a bond, they said. It's your duty. Meanwhile, inflation quietly climbed. The government called it sacrifice. Economists now call it monetary expansion. But the mechanism was already in motion, and the public never saw the lever being pulled. The real question isn't whether war bonds worked. It's whether they were ever meant to. What if the biggest war in history wasn't financed by savings, but by a controlled dilution of the currency itself? If this opened another side of history for you, comment where you're watching from. In September 1939, Britain and France declared war on Germany. Within days, financial systems across Europe were on emergency footing. Gold reserves were locked down, capital controls tightened, national currencies came under direct government management. But across the Atlantic, the United States was still formally neutral. The American economy had only just emerged from the trauma of the Great Depression. Unemployment remained high, public debt hovered near $40 billion, a staggering figure at the time. Yet within just 6 years, that debt would more than quadruple. How? To understand the mechanics, we must step back. In 1930, the global financial system had already begun to fracture. The gold standard, once seen as a pillar of monetary stability, was collapsing under the weight of competing national interests. Countries devalued their currencies to gain export advantages. Gold flows reversed direction. And confidence, that invisible thread holding markets together, began to tear. By 1933, Franklin D. Roosevelt had suspended gold convertibility for U.S. citizens. A year later, he revalued the dollar, effectively devaluing the currency by 41%. It was a radical move, but it gave the federal government something it desperately needed: room to maneuver. Now imagine this. A system built on the promise of value suddenly declared that promise negotiable. This flexibility, controversial at the time, became the quiet foundation of wartime finance. Without it, the U.S. could not have issued debt at the scale it did, nor could it have controlled the interest rates necessary to keep that debt affordable. Meanwhile, the Federal Reserve, created just 3 decades earlier, found its mandate shifted. Originally conceived to stabilize banking and manage liquidity, it now became a silent partner in federal fiscal strategy. When the war began in Europe, the Roosevelt administration moved fast. Neutrality was maintained publicly, but economically, the gears were already turning. The Lend-Lease Act of 1941 effectively bypassed budget constraints allowing the U.S. to provide materials to allies on credit. But credit from where? The Treasury borrowed, the Fed cooperated, and the American public was asked to believe. War bonds entered the scene not as a financial necessity, but as a narrative tool. Posters, radio ads, school campaigns, all worked to create the impression that each citizen was a shareholder in the war. Economically, it was mass participation. Psychologically, it was mass mobilization. In truth, the numbers tell a colder story. Between 1940 and 1945, federal spending increased by more than 900%. Tax revenues rose, yes, thanks to sweeping changes to the tax code, but not fast enough. The gap was filled with debt. And to keep interest rates from rising, the Fed implemented something unprecedented, a ceiling on government bond yields. In effect, the central bank guaranteed a market for war debt. Any shortfall in demand would be met with newly created money. The system was subtle but effective. The public saw bonds as savings. The government used them as cover for monetary expansion. And the central bank made sure the engine didn't overheat, at least not immediately. This was not a conspiracy. It was policy, a coordinated effort between the Treasury, the Federal Reserve, and the Office of War Information. Each played a role, each shaped public perception, and none revealed the full picture. What does that mean? It means that by the time victory was declared in 1945, the U.S. had laid the foundation for a new kind of economic power, one not based on gold or trade surplus, but on the ability to borrow indefinitely in its own currency at controlled rates, a privilege disguised as obligation. And the post-war world would be built atop that illusion. By early 1943, American war production had reached its peak. Tanks, ships, and aircraft were rolling off assembly lines faster than the enemy could destroy them. Steel output had tripled. Unemployment had vanished. But the numbers didn't add up. The government was now spending more than double the country's entire GDP just 5 years earlier. Every minute, Washington burned through over $175,000, and yet interest rates remained frozen. Inflation was controlled, on the surface, and public support for war bonds soared. Something didn't fit. If the government was borrowing at record levels, why weren't interest rates climbing? If so much money was circulating, why weren't prices exploding? The answer lay beneath the bond posters, behind the parades, inside the vaults of the Federal Reserve. A secret coordination mechanism had been activated, something most citizens never knew existed. In 1942, the U.S. Treasury and the Federal Reserve signed a formal agreement. The Fed would cap interest rates on government debt. Short-term yields would stay at 0.3%, long-term bonds at 2.5%, no matter the deficit, no matter the volume. But maintaining that illusion required one thing: intervention. If the public or private banks didn't buy enough war bonds, the Federal Reserve did. It stepped in as a buyer of last resort, printing money to absorb the gap. Between 1942 and 1945, the Fed's holdings of government securities more than doubled. This wasn't passive support. It was direct monetization of debt. And now imagine the paradox. The war was financed, in part, not through savings, but through silent expansion of the money supply. The public was told they were investing in victory. In fact, they were participating in a carefully controlled inflation scheme. Why controlled? Because without controls, the system would collapse. The Office of Price Administration froze consumer prices and wages. Rationing became widespread. Advertising disguised scarcity as patriotism. The illusion had to be airtight, because if people understood that their dollars were losing value in real time, the entire financial front would unravel. Here lies the core problem. The war economy was built on dual realities. One, public, symbolic, democratic. The other, technical, centralized, opaque. Citizens saw bonds. Economists saw balance sheets. And the two rarely aligned. By 1945, nearly 40% of the U.S. economy was government-directed. Private enterprise existed, but on government terms. The largest corporate profits in American history up to that point were recorded during the war. funded by federal contracts, backed by printed money, legitimized by bond drives. So the question must be asked, was this sustainable? Could a monetary system survive if its foundation was belief in a fiction? Historians often point to the Marshall Plan, Bretton Woods, and post-war growth as proof that it worked. But consider this. By the end of the war, the U.S. national debt had ballooned to $269 billion. Servicing that debt required a permanent commitment to low interest rates and to a public that never questioned where money came from. The war had been won, but the bill had just arrived. And its payment would stretch over decades, hidden in inflation, buried in balance sheets, repackaged in peacetime terms. From 1945 forward, the bond wasn't just a financial instrument. It became a psychological one. If this reframed how you see national debt, share your thoughts below. To understand how the illusion held together, we have to look inside the machine. War bonds were marketed as a civic duty, but economically, they functioned as a liquidity drain. Each bond sold meant money was pulled from the economy and handed to the Treasury. The public believed it was helping pay for the war, but behind that clean exchange was a second loop, invisible but far more powerful. Here's how it worked. Step 1. The Treasury needed funds. It issued war bonds at fixed rates, say 2.5% for a 10-year maturity. Step 2. The public was encouraged, pressured, and sometimes directly compelled to buy those bonds. Corporations were given quotas, workers were offered payroll deductions, schools ran bond drives, even comic books urged children to fight Hitler with nickels. But the public could only absorb so much. There was a natural ceiling, and that's where Step 3 entered. Whatever the public didn't buy, the banks did. And if the banks hesitated, the Federal Reserve intervened. It purchased the bonds directly, using money it created, not printed, but typed into existence through open market operations. Ledger entries, backed by nothing but trust. The Fed's balance sheet began to swell. This wasn't a backstop, it was a controlled ecosystem, a triad. Treasury issues debt, the Fed stabilizes rates, and the public legitimizes the process by participating, even if unknowingly. Economists call this financial repression, the deliberate suppression of interest rates to reduce the real cost of debt. But there was more. To prevent inflation from spiraling, the government imposed price controls. Consumer goods were rationed, wages were frozen, advertising was weaponized to turn sacrifice into virtue. This created a unique distortion. Money was being created but not fully spent. Demand was choked off while supply was redirected to military production. The result? A buildup of dormant inflation. In today's terms, imagine a balloon filling steadily with air but clamped shut at the neck. Pressure mounts but nothing bursts, yet. The war economy operated under this pressure for years. By war's end, personal savings had soared, not because Americans were frugal, but because there was little to spend money on. Goods were scarce, choices limited. The government called it patriotism. In economic terms, it was deferred consumption and deferred risk. Because once the war ended, clamps were removed, price controls lifted, pent-up demand flooded the market, the balloon neck opened, inflation surged. But that too was managed, carefully, tactically, with a combination of continued Fed interventions and a gradual shift in public focus. The narrative moved from war bonds to post-war prosperity. But the underlying system hadn't changed. War bonds were redeemed. New debt replaced the old. The central bank remained the silent partner. And that's the core of the mechanism. The war wasn't paid for once. It was financed again and again by rolling debt, managing yields, and maintaining public belief that the system was sound. A kind of monetary theater where the audience applauded while the stagehands worked in shadows. No conspiracy, just design. And the model didn't vanish with the victory parades. It became the blueprint. Today we call them Treasury securities. We hold interest rates near zero. We speak of quantitative easing instead of bond support. But the process, debt issue, central bank absorption, narrative control remains intact. The difference, back then the excuse was war. Today, it's stability. If this helped you see how money moves behind the curtain, tell me where you're watching from. By the end of 1945, the United States have won the war and inherited the world. But behind the flags and the rebuilding lay a more subtle outcome, a permanent shift in the architecture of economic power. The Treasury was now used to deficits, the Federal Reserve was used to compliance, and the American public had been trained over 6 years to associate debt with patriotism. The system had crossed a line, quietly, permanently. Before the war, issuing large-scale debt required justification. After the war, it required a form. Bureaucratic, procedural, routine. What changed? First, scale. In 1939, total U.S. federal debt was $40 billion. By 1946, it was over $269 billion, a 570% increase in 7 years. Second, precedent. The war had proven that massive public debt could be not only tolerated, but normalized if framed as necessary. Economists knew this, politicians learned it. Third, central bank behavior. The Federal Reserve had spent the war years fixing rates, absorbing unwanted bonds, and expanding its balance sheet without public debate. That behavior didn't end with the war. It had become structural. And the consequences rippled outward. Bond markets were no longer purely private. Interest rates became a matter of policy, not price discovery. Inflation became a tool, not a threat. The lines blurred. In the late 1940s, inflation surged. Prices rose by nearly 14% in 1947 alone. Wages lagged, savings lost value. Yet the government insisted on continuity. The Fed remained locked into the wartime agreement, holding interest rates down while real returns went negative. In effect, the debt was being paid, not by taxes, not by surpluses, but by stealth, through inflation, through the erosion of purchasing power, through time. And someone always pays. Middle-class savers saw their bond holdings decline in real value. Workers faced rising costs without proportionate wages. Fixed incomes lost ground. The redistribution was silent, systemic. That was the cost of victory. Meanwhile, corporations that had expanded under war contracts pivoted to peacetime markets with their infrastructure intact. Many had been financed indirectly through public debt, now amortized by inflation. A transfer of capital executed without announcement. But the deepest consequence wasn't financial. It was psychological. The war had trained a generation to view government debt as a national instrument, not a burden, to accept central banking as a neutral tool, not a force of leverage, to see money as policy, not value. And the illusion was durable because it had delivered results. It had worked. The war had been won, the economy had grown, and the story held. But the mechanism had its limits. In 1951, tensions between the Treasury and the Fed finally broke into the open. The Fed no longer wanted to cap bond yields. Inflation had become untenable. A compromise was reached, the Treasury-Fed Accord, a formal end to the wartime arrangement. Officially, the Fed regained independence. Unofficially, the pattern had already been set. The United States would continue to finance its ambitions, military, geopolitical, economic, through structured debt, underwritten by a central bank and supported by public belief. The war may have ended. The mechanism did not. And over time, it became harder to tell the difference between finance and fiction. Then it was called patriotism. Today, it's called stability. But the mechanism hasn't changed. After 1945, the war bond posters came down. The victory gardens faded. The slogans disappeared. But the structure they justified remained. What was once a temporary emergency tool, direct monetary financing, interest rate suppression, psychological debt normalization, became a permanent feature of modern economies. Let's bring it forward. In 2008, the global financial system collapsed under its own complexity. Derivatives, shadow banking, subprime mortgages, all burst in sequence. Government stepped in. Central banks stepped up. And the playbook returned. Only this time there were no war bonds, no school children saving coins, just headlines. Quantitative easing, stimulus packages, too big to fail. But the logic was identical. Debt exploded. Central banks bought government bonds. Interest rates were held down, near zero or even below. Inflation remained quiet, at first. And the public was told it was all temporary. Does that sound familiar? Between 2008 and 2022, the U.S. Federal Reserve's balance sheet grew from under $1 trillion to nearly $9 trillion. That's not a side effect. That is the system. Just as in the 1940s, the appearance of market activity conceals a managed structure. Central banks act as buyers of last resort, keeping bond markets liquid and rates low, not because markets demand it, but because the system cannot function otherwise. And instead of posters, we have press conferences. Instead of slogans, guidance. Instead of war, crisis after crisis, economic, epidemiological, geopolitical. In each case, the response is the same. Borrow, monetize, suppress rates, and ask the public to believe. But belief wears thin. In 2021, inflation returned, more suddenly, more globally than policymakers predicted. Official narratives called it transitory. It wasn't. Just as in 1947, post-crisis inflation revealed the true cost of prior intervention. This time, the consequences fell unevenly. Real wages stagnated, asset prices soared. Debt burdens rose but remained deceptively affordable, thanks again to low rates. And here's the paradox. The same mechanism used to fight war now sustains peace. The same tools used to finance destruction now underpin global stability. But the underlying truth remains. Debt is the product, and central banks are its engineers. Some economists call this fiscal dominance, when the central bank in practice serves the needs of the Treasury even while appearing independent. Others simply call it inevitable, because in a system addicted to cheap money, independence becomes choreography. The illusion must hold. And so what began as a wartime measure has become the foundation of modern finance. There are no more bond rallies in town squares, no victory parades for balancing budgets. But the emotional architecture remains, invisible yet present. Because nothing inspires belief like crisis, and nothing sustains a system like silence. Then it was war bonds. Now it's stimulus. History didn't change, only the label did. If this helped connect the past to what's happening around you today, share where you're watching from. There was a moment in 1943 when a Treasury official, reviewing yet another campaign script for war bonds, scribbled a note in the margin. Confidence is more valuable than gold. The line was never published, but the system remembered it. Because in the end, the war wasn't just fought with tanks, planes, and factories. It was fought with numbers, with promises, with trust. And trust, once manufactured successfully, doesn't fade. It replicates. We live in its shadow now. The debt machine kept running. The slogans changed. The uniforms changed. The purpose changed. But the structure, debt issued, belief maintained, money created, did not. It became self-reinforcing, self-justifying. And somewhere along the way, war bonds turned into treasury auctions. Central banks became the buyers. Crises became the pretext. And illusion became infrastructure. The line between emergency and design disappeared. History doesn't repeat, it recalibrates. It waits for us to believe again.